Good afternoon, everybody. We're just waiting for everyone to stream in. Another 10 seconds or so and we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. Delighted to have you with us this afternoon for this panel that focuses on hydrogen and specifically hydrogen in the Canadian context. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which the University of Ottawa sits is the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. And I would encourage each of you to acknowledge the territory on which you are sitting today, wherever you're tuning in from. So this is the first panel of the year for the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy, and we've just had absolutely outstanding registrations for this panel. Something in the order of 400 people have registered. Everyone's just starting to stream in right now. I think that speaks to the interest in hydrogen and panels that dive a little bit deeper into the details on hydrogen. But more on that in a moment. For now, I wanted to introduce you to the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy. I'm the director of the ISSP. My name is Monica Gattinger. I'm a professor here at the University of Ottawa. And the ISSP is a cross-faculty research institute focusing on the interface between science, society, and policy. We focus in on issues including science for policy, so AKA evidence-based or evidence-informed decision-making. We focus on policies for science, technology, and innovation, and we focus on governance of emerging technologies. So certainly hydrogen fits into all of those categories, and we're delighted to offer this panel here today. So hydrogen, lots of attention to hydrogen these days at both the federal and provincial levels, notably in Alberta, British Columbia, and Quebec, but also in my province here of Ontario as well. At the federal level, last fall, many will know that hydrogen was part of a broader suite of climate policies, strategies, and announcements. Ottawa tabled net zero by 2050 legislation. It introduced a climate plan, ramping up the carbon tax to $170 per ton by 2030. And it also tabled national strategies for hydrogen and for small modular reactors. So where does hydrogen fit in to Canada's energy future in an age of climate change? What would a hydrogen economy look like? What are the political, policy, regulatory, technical, economic, environmental opportunities, challenges, and next steps for hydrogen in Canada? And as many will know, this is not the first time hydrogen's received a lot of attention, but we haven't seen wide-scale deployment of the technology. Why not? What will be different this time? That's where this panel fits in. We have three tremendous speakers. I'll introduce them each, provide you with a brief bio of each of the speakers, and then we'll get into their remarks. So our first speaker will be Camille Gabriel. Camille is professor at the Faculty of Engineering and Applied Science at Ontario Tech University. We're also delighted that he's a senior fellow with us here at the ISSP. And he's the person who suggested we organize this panel. So we're very grateful to Camille for that excellent suggestion. Dr. Gabriel is the founding associate provost of research and graduate programs at Ontario Tech. He's also co-founder and past president of the Durham Strategic Energy Alliance. In 2009, Dr. Gabriel was seconded to the Ontario Ministry of Research and Innovation as the Assistant Deputy Minister of Research. And in that role, he was also the ministry's first ever science advisor. Most recently, Camille was invited by the government of Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates, to assist with the creation of a research funding agency to support competitive research efforts in the federal and private higher education institutions. Our second panelist is Peter Tertzakian, who is Executive Director of ARC Energy Research Institute. Peter is also a member of the Advisory Council for the ISSP's flagship energy program, positive energy. We're really delighted to have him sit on our advisory council. For those who don't know Peter, he began his career as a geophysicist in 1982. I actually didn't know that about Peter, so I'm learning things too. He then moved in from oil and gas to the finance and economics sector in 1990. This background, combined with his entrepreneurial spirit, that part of Peter I know quite well, helped him become an internationally recognized expert in energy matters. Peter publishes ARC Energy Charts, a weekly journal of real-time business indicators, and he writes regularly at the Financial Post. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Calgary and has published 2 best-selling books. If you haven't read them, please do. 1,000 Barrels a Second and The End of Energy Obesity. Our third speaker is Tahra Jutt. Tahra is the director of the Clean Economy Program in BC at the Pembina Institute. Her work focuses on policies that promote both a strong energy sector as well as reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Before joining Pembina, Tahra worked in the private sector on strategy, on government and regulatory affairs to advance clean technology innovations, in particular, low emissions transportation and alternative fuel technology. So she's very well positioned to comment on hydrogen, and we're delighted to have her with us today. So the format for the session is going to be some brief opening remarks from each panelist, about 5 minutes or so. We're going to keep things brief so we can leave lots of time for a moderated discussion that's going to follow those remarks, and then a Q&A from the audience. So, please do share your questions with us. Pour ce qui est de la section pour les questions, vous pouvez vous sentir à l'aise de poser vos questions dans les 2 langues. Je peux certainement les traduire pour les panélistes, alors soyez-vous bien à l'aise. The event will be streamed on YouTube. It's streaming live right now, and it's going to be shared as well on other social media platforms. So for those of you who weren't able to join us today, they will be able to watch the event afterwards. So without further ado, I will jump right into giving the floor to our first speaker, Camille Gabriel. Camille, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. You'll need to put it into, I think, presentation mode, Camille.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Monica. And kudos to you and to the Institute for being effective reporters on policies. And I'm delighted to take part of this very important topic today. And it is important because it is global. We have gone through it before, and this time we need to get it right. So I'm going to dive in because of the time frame we have. Just lay some foundational pieces here for our discussion today, some definition for those who maybe are not very familiar with the hydrogen. Right now we have some language of colors of hydrogen, starting with gray, which is produced from fossil fuels, natural gas, coal, and oil. And you can see in the hydrogen value chain that that constitutes approximately 2/3 of the hydrogen production today. And that could be with or without carbon capture. If it is with carbon capture and storage, then we call it blue hydrogen. And 1/3, the other 1/3 of the hydrogen is a byproduct from chemical processes. And a very small amount comes from renewables that is labeled green. And now we have also heard for a new definition of purple, which is renewable but dedicated from nuclear. So as you can see, most of the hydrogen produced to date is from fossil fuel, has obviously an impact of CO2 production. And on the right-hand side of that graph, you can see where the hydrogen is primarily used in refining, ammonia production, synthetic gases, and very small amount still in transportation. And the question is how much hydrogen is currently produced. In Canada, today, approximately 3 metric megatons per year. Once again, primarily used on the sector that I showed you in the previous slide. In the US, about 10. Globally, it's about 70 megatons per year. Of that, the electrolyzer hydrogen produced via electrolyzers is only 0.2 gigawatt capacity, global capacity. And to make that competitive as a green source of hydrogen, you need to push that to 70 gigawatts, which means that you have to increase the electricity generation worldwide by at least 50%, because 1/5 of that electricity will be used to generate hydrogen by 2050. On the right-hand side, you can see the hydrogen outlook by Bloomberg, and it gives three scenarios. If the hydrogen policy in the nation is weak, well, it will just about triple the amount of demand to approximately 190. If it is a strong policy, then it will be a factor of 10 increase. And if, in fact, we can theoretically assume that the hydrogen will invade almost every sector of the economy, buildings, power, and industry, and transportation, you are looking at 1,370 megatons per year. A footnote here, just South Korea announced in their policy that they would like to produce 1,200 megatons per year, just one nation, by 2025. So that gives you the magnitude of the aspiration of nations in producing hydrogen. We will be talking about carbon intensity of hydrogen, which is a better classification than colors. And you can see the carbon intensity of hydrogen varies significantly depending on the source of production, whether it is hard coal, with or without carbon capture. From natural gas, you can see it without CCUS, it's about 9 kilograms of CO2 for every kilogram of hydrogen produced. And from electricity, well, it depends very much on the source of electricity. If it is a clean source or renewable, such as nuclear, well, it's almost nailed. But if it is gas-fired or coal-fired, well, you can see it significantly higher. And the world average is about 26 kilogram CO2 per kilogram hydrogen. We are also going to probably touch on the marginal abatement cost of using 1 kilogram of hydrogen for emission. And you can see that starts with a small, almost zero cost abatement for transportation sector. But as we move into the large emitters such as steel production, cement, and chemical and material, obviously that will increase significantly in the $80 and $100 per CO2. Very quickly here, how much it costs to produce hydrogen using different techniques. This is a study that was completed by Chris Reed from Kona in BC, presented last November. And you can see the target is $2 per kilogram as kind of the aim for producing hydrogen. And it varies quite a bit, of course, on, depending on the process itself. For the blue hydrogen that I alluded to earlier, it is possibly under 2. In fact, it is under 2 at this point of time. As you move to green, obviously not at scale, still quite significant, 4 or 4.5. But again, the Bloomberg anticipates that that will change dramatically with the green method almost on par with the blue by 2030, and in fact going even below $2 per kilogram by 2050. So it looks very good outlook for the green. I don't have much time, so I'm just going to summarize with a couple of points here that, in my opinion, that what is of most importance is focusing on producing low-cost, scalable green hydrogen to make us competitive in this growing economy. And we need to focus on the scale-up to get the biggest bang of our investment. We believe in Ontario Tech here that water splitting by a thermochemical cycle using waste process heat is one of the most economical and greenest method of producing hydrogen at scale. We should note that the technologies necessary for tomorrow's innovation need to be spurred in a large scale to allow people to enter into this new economy and succeed. And I should finish by noting that hydrogen alone is not enough to reach our aspiration for zero carbon by 2050. We need to look at a holistic approach, and hopefully we can get into the discussion to touch on that. Finally, our to climate change, I'll finish with this thought, should be innovation, adaptation, and mitigation. In essence, I am responsible, and each one of us is responsible as well. And with that, I'll just stop here, Monica. Thank you.
Terrific. Terrific. Thank you so much, Kamiel. That was, I think you deserve an award for moving through all of that information in basically 6 minutes. That's extremely well done. There are a couple of questions that are coming in already around technologies, but we'll get to those when we get to the Q&A session. For now, thank you so much, Kamiel, and we'll move on to our second speaker, Peter Tertzakian. Peter.
Hi, well, thank you, Monica. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be part of the panel discussion. So I'll start by referring to the hydrogen strategy report put out by the government. The opening words, paraphrased, or something like, "We've been working on a hydrogen strategy for more than a century to bring the invisible promise of hydrogen into tangible solutions." And I'm optimistic about that promise. I'm optimistic it can be realized this time. And I say this time, and even Kamiel in his opening remarks said this time, implying that there's been other eras, which there have, during which time it was not successful. As an investment strategist and an economist, I'm trained to be pragmatic. In other words, realistic in terms of what can and can't be done. And Monica, you've asked me to be a bit of a foil to this discussion. In other words, be the voice that discusses some of the barriers and challenges to the adoption of hydrogen, because in the past, there have been many challenges and adoptions. I mean, hydrogen as being recognized as a potential fuel energy carrier for society has been around for over 100 years. And so too have other things. You know, it's really easy to get excited about disruptive energy transitions. And I've got my museum actually behind me over there with all sorts of energy artifacts from the past. If you'd like to take a look at some of that, you can go to energyphile.org and take a look at some of the stuff. And I study those transitions. And, you know, from my collection, I've got this magazine here from 1971, 50 years ago, a new breakthrough electric car. It looks suspiciously like the Model 3, had a lot of the same performance parameters. Well, why didn't it take off in 1970? We had another era in the 1990s, again in the 2000s. It's only recently, 50 years later, that Elon Musk and Tesla finally were at an inflection point where it's taking off. What were the conditions precedent that were required for that to happen? Or more importantly, what were the lack of conditions precedent that precluded the adoption of electric vehicles? Because when we understand things like that, we can understand what are the inhibitors or the barriers to a successful hydrogen strategy, which is all really in the execution. Now, the last episode of hydrogen was around 2000, and I certainly remember it well, being in the finance business, because I was part of many financings that were being done very aggressively in that era. Back then, many of the stocks in hydrogen were rocketing up, much as they are even today. Some of the names are the same, actually. A lot of the stocks 20 years ago were riding on the technology wave, again, very reminiscent of today. Back then, it was Web 2.0, the first generation of online shopping. And in the energy world, it was things like hydrogen, supercapacitors, smart grids, and so on. What were the things that were not precedent there? Because, you know, the realization set in quite quickly that you can't just throw money at this. And it's not all about technology. There have to be a collection of factors that allow for an adoption. And that's not just for hydrogen. It's not just for electric vehicles. It went for whether it was light bulbs 120, 140 years ago with Thomas Edison. I mean, there has to be the right set of conditions for an energy transition to happen. The government report on hydrogen is really excellent reading. I fully recommend it. It's 141 pages, pretty easy to read. My only comment on that report is that out of the 141 pages, there's only 3 that are on remaining challenges. I think we need to have a deeper conversation. I think the 3 pages needs to be substantially expanded. It talks about technology and innovation. I would say technology and innovation is not the limiting factor to hydrogen. There is a lot of technology out there. It's improving, it's getting better. Policy and regulation is identified. I think that policy and regulation, it has to be applied properly. I think the government and the regulatory bodies are positioning it properly, but there's work to be done to make sure that it's done in the right thing. I think where the report is lacking and where more things need to be understood is investment. As I said, mere money flowing into a space is an insufficient condition to make things happen. That's what happened 20 years ago. And in fact, it can work against you. Investment can be very fleeting. If expectations are set too high, investors lose money. if investors lose money, they don't come back for a while. We have to be very careful that the expectations are properly set, that it works out. The public markets can be your biggest friend. They can also be a big nightmare. Infrastructure is identified, and I think this is where it really gets key, and I'd like to talk more about it on this session. We've seen the success now, the catalyzation of electric vehicles, wind and solar. I would argue to you those were mostly plug and play. The electric vehicle plugs into electric infrastructure, wind and solar plug in on the front end, and you unplug a coal-fired power plant. Okay, I know that's sort of a trite and trivial way of looking at things, but with hydrogen, there's a whole system in between that has to be established, and infrastructure is going to be a key thing to look at. Thomas Edison, I mentioned the light bulb, and I've got his book here. That is one of my favorite books from a business perspective, especially because he was such a tenacious competitor, such a tenacious inventor. And he poses a question, effectively paraphrased again, which comes first, the light bulb or the grid? And the answer is actually a fully functioning light bulb comes first. In other words, you need the application and then you build out the infrastructure. Okay, we can get into that discussion if you want, but I would argue too that the emphasis needs to be on making sure that the end use applications work. Then the grid follows, not the other way around. Again, we can debate this and I'd be happy to do so. But if you look at many successful energy transitions, it's the application that has to be proven first before you spend a lot of money. I also think, like, who is the champion? Who is the champion of hydrogen? Clearly the champion for electric vehicles was Elon Musk. I think that's a question that we need to understand. Well, there are many other things. In the awareness is another issue that's been raised by the report. I would say one thing that's missing in the report that I think really needs attention is the functioning of a hydrogen trading market. If you look at all the other energy commodities, oil, gas, petroleum products, electricity, and the list goes on, there is a fully functioning and deep financial market for those commodities. In other words, you can hedge into the future and so on. I can't even find spot prices for hydrogen online. I have no idea what the real-time price for hydrogen is. You need to have a fully functioning market across the entire supply chain from beginning to end to be able to make this work. That's not to say it can't happen. I think that the report offers a lot of very good points about the strategy going forward, but it's time to take that report. It is a call to action, as it says, but we need to now think about how we are going to actually execute in great detail and make sure that it's the cart before the horse or the horse before the cart. And make sure that it all works. So I think we can this time, I think, bring the invisible promise to reality. The conditions precedent to make it work are far better than they were 20 years ago, but they need to be put together in the right order, in the right way, and organized and executed to make it work.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Peter. And I think that really speaks to a lot of the work that we've been doing at Positive Energy, which is, on many of these issues, it requires that integrated approach that brings together not only climate imperatives, but energy imperatives from a market perspective, from a security perspective, looking at broader environmental issues and the like. And that's, challenging to do, but absolutely essential in order to get those conditions right, as you've noted, Peter. We've got lots of questions that are rolling in, which is terrific. So glad to see that. One thing I did just want to note for people is that unless you specifically ask me to, I will not list your name when I ask the questions. So if you would like me to note that the question is from a particular person, please let me know. But lots of great questions rolling in. I don't think we'll have any shortage of things to discuss between now and the end of the session. For now, though, I am just delighted to give the floor to Tahra Jutt to bring her perspective to these issues. Tahra, what do you think?
Well, thank you, Monica. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. And today I'm just going to touch on some of the things that Pembina Institute has been thinking about with regards to hydrogen and climate. But before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. So today, as we said, I've listened to both the panelists today, and I agree that hydrogen is going to be one of those things that we need to talk a little bit more deeply about. Today, I'm going to focus a little bit about hydrogen and the role it plays in our energy future. So as Canada and the world are looking to achieve more ambitious climate targets, the transition away from fossil fuels to lower carbon and carbon neutral energy sources is more important than ever. And having an understanding of what our energy needs will be, along with what the energy mix should look like, is a discussion that we need to have now as we move closer to the 2030 and 2050 targets. And as we're setting down frameworks to accommodate this transition. Today, as you know, Canada is still really dependent on fossil fuels for energy. And hydrogen is being increasingly discussed as a promising and versatile energy source that can reduce the amount of fossil fuels currently being used in sectors such as transportation, heavy industry, and even in buildings. But the climate advantage of hydrogen is highly dependent on how it's produced. And I think that's something that we need to pay a little bit more attention to if we're looking at hydrogen as being part of a climate solution. Today, as Camille alluded to, most hydrogen produced today is gray with no carbon capture and with a high carbon intensity. Blue hydrogen with some carbon capture and green hydrogen primarily derived from electrolysis and clean electricity are combined are less than 1%. So there's quite a ways to go in terms of having a clean source of hydrogen in the market today. There's other means of producing hydrogen from biomass, from nuclear power, and other emerging technologies which have been discussed in government strategies in how to produce hydrogen. But, you know, I think really that where the rubber hits the road is really, you know, how clean is it and how much of it is there? And as we look to the full suite of energy options needed to reach our climate goals, we know that hydrogen has a role to play in the energy mix, but where? And I think part of the role is going to be in hard to decarbonize sectors. It can also support the expansion of renewable energy generation, help renewable energy or renewable electricity storage in operations like power to gas, or used in where electrification is not really an option. So I think those are the sectors that we have to look at as potential best uses for hydrogen. And as we peel back the layers of this hydrogen question, we realize that hydrogen is not a one-size-fits-all solution for reducing emissions. It's energy intensive to produce and it can be difficult to transport to market. So realizing the potential of hydrogen will require that sectors, to identify those sectors where it's the highest and best use. We're going to need to continue to fund research on new and cost-effective technologies. We're going to have to account for regional context and also look at the policies to encourage production and use. So how are we going to get it mainstreamed and what kind of incentives are going to be needed to make that happen? And the background to this is also having new codes and standards to set the stage for the introduction of the technologies into the market to make sure that there's, you know, when you have a technology, that there's a seamless integration of that technology and there isn't some regulatory barrier to making it function and consumers can use it. To sum up, hydrogen is only a potential climate solution if it's produced in a way that minimizes carbon emissions. And because there's such a large range in carbon intensity of the production of hydrogen, we really need to have an ambitious definition of low carbon hydrogen, along with a standardized approach to measuring it. And I think that as we look at the hydrogen strategy, the federal strategy, they're alluding to you know, going to green or going to zero as soon as possible. And I think that's really where we need to go. In addition, there's policy and regulatory frameworks are needed to ensure that the carbon intensity over its whole life cycle declines rapidly over time, and that we're not doing a dash to 2050 to make sure that we are actually reducing that carbon intensity. We need to ensure that renewable hydrogen production is encouraged, that renewable content is encouraged, and that there's support for innovation in other tools that we have to reduce emissions like carbon capture and storage across different regions in Canada. Lastly, the opportunity for hydrogen is emerging, and I think that we all understand that the conditions and political will are aligning on this topic. Many countries are embarking on the road to developing hydrogen and hydrogen technologies, but it's important to ensure that all the frameworks are put in place for it to become part of a successful option within a low carbon energy transition. And with that, I give it back to Monica.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tahra. I really like that phrase. The climate advantage is dependent upon how it's produced. That pretty much sums it up from the climate perspective. And I think, many of the questions that are coming in are really getting at particular considerations for Canada. So whether it's federalism, or whether it's Canada's vast hydropower potential, or its proximity to the United States and the opportunities for collaboration and coordination. And I think that's why I'd like us to take our first question, is really looking at, how can Canada, quote unquote, kind of get it right this time? What can we learn from past periods where there's been a lot of attention to hydrogen? And what for Canada would be the things, sort of the top things that the country needs to do to get it right. So I'm going to push you guys a little bit further. I mean, I take all the points that have been raised around, we need the right conditions, you need the policy and regulatory frameworks, you need, the technology that works, all of these issues. But for Canada then specifically, what does that look like? So I'll open it there and see where our panelists would want to take that, how they'd respond to that question. Who wants to jump in first?
Okay, well, very briefly, and I mean, you can't start the house without a foundation.
Well, I think Kamiel might have frozen. At least he's frozen on my. Oh, there we go. Kamiel, you froze for a second there. You said you can't build the house without a foundation. So take it from there, because we lost you for a second.
Yeah, so we need the foundation. The foundation is to create demand, and also to have the infrastructure and the value chain established in Canada. As Peter alluded to, the strategy speaks very well in terms of positioning us. But we need action in terms of creating that infrastructure, creating that demand in so many sectors, facilitating the entrance to that new technology, and spurring innovation. So these have to be done, and the call for action should be really call for action.
Great. Thoughts from others?
Yeah, I think that the approach that we're taking in Alberta here is a good one. There's groups like the Transition Accelerator and others. It's sort of a walk before you can run approach. I mean, if you think about changing out and adapting our entire Canadian energy infrastructure to hydrogen, it just makes your head hurt with all these issues. But if you actually boil it down to like the hub concept, in other words, start out small, do a little region, make an economy start working from beginning of the supply chain to the end, get the market going even within that little thing, and then you start building and growing. I mean, this is the way, for example, I'll go back to Edison. I mean, that's the way the light bulb and his grid was commercialized. It was in southern Manhattan where they started, and it started to grow as it is. And I think that's how it's going to happen. I think that there's opportunity across the country to do it with the different types of, or the different spectrum of colors of hydrogen, and whether it originates at hydro or solar or wind or even the blue hydrogen and so on, and just start small, prove it out, and grow it.
Great. Tahra, thoughts from you on this one?
Sure. I think we really have to understand what we're trying to achieve, and then put down a strategy to implement it. I agree that having a small scale hub or area where you can test it out in maybe more mature technologies, to get people acclimatized, to get consumers, to get end users comfortable and willing to make investments once they see technology is working and it's working for them. You can build out more technologies and more end uses. If your goal is to have it as a climate solution, it's a little bit different than having a commercial use. It's really looking at how to decarbonize your energy system, and I think that takes a lot of investment and targeted approach as well to make sure that what you're doing is going to have the objective that you're hoping for.
Well, yeah, there's no question when Kamiel was giving his presentation and talking about at the global level, a doubling of electricity capacity, and we hear similar sorts of figures for the Canadian context, whether it's in relation to hydrogen or in relation to electrifying the economy writ large. It's quite daunting. So what are some of those deeper conversations? I'll use that terminology that we need to have about hydrogen fuels in Canada. Like, what's missing? Is there something missing in the current discourse debate on these issues that would be useful to spend put more attention on?
Well, I think the discourse is there. I think the understanding of how all participants in a hydrogen supply chain make money is really the critical one. I mean, if the hydrogen supply chain from beginning to end is not commercial, it's not going to happen very effectively. The adoption will be slow, and you need to have that to address the climate problem, further to what Tahra's saying, because merely spending government money isn't going to work. And by the way, the government doesn't have enough money to make it work. You have to have the free market and investment participate to build it out and create that functioning hydrogen economy. I mean, I think that phrase is appropriate, hydrogen economy. Mm-hmm. And we do have actually a pretty big functioning hydrogen economy right now, and most of it's in Alberta within the hydrocarbon economy. A lot of hydrogen is used in refining and so on. And in many ways, Alberta is an ideal place because it already has an infrastructure off of we can sort of retool and figure out how to do things. But it's, you got to make it work from beginning to end. And as I said, this is like, I think a lot of the effort does have to go in understanding, for example, in heavy duty transport, whether it's rail or big vehicles, trucks and things. We have to work with railroad companies and trucking companies to make sure that it works for them. But they're not going to commit to it. It's a chicken and egg thing unless they know, well, what's the future price of hydrogen going to be? And how does that compare with diesel? Mm-hmm. And how does that compare with diesel with a carbon tax? We don't know the answers to these. And until the commercial element of the supply chain can figure that out, it's not going to attract investment. So, we've just got to, this is why experimenting at a small level to prove it out is really important.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, sort of another piece of that, then I love this thought, Peter, of kind of everybody along the value chain needs to be able to make money. The economic aspects need to be there. I mean, Tahra, you pointed out in your remarks that the policy and regulatory aspects also need to be there. And what's your sense of how the hydrogen strategy sits in the broader context of climate policies and statements made by the federal government last fall? Whether it's the ramping up the carbon tax or net zero by 2050 legislation. Does this sort of provide the broader policy context, or what's missing?
Well, I think hydrogen is going to be part of a broad mix of lower carbon fuels. And I think that we can't take the attention and all the money and say we're only going to invest in hydrogen because that's going to solve all our problems. I think we have to have a more holistic approach to low carbon fuels. And I think that pricing mechanisms are one way to encourage the production of those uses, production of those fuels, and it also helps value chain, monetize the value chain. So you will see new technologies coming online to produce lower carbon fuels because there's a market for those lower carbon fuels. So I think hydrogen has to play a role in that. And I think the policies that the government is is looking to enact and is enacting a carbon tax, clean fuel standard. In BC, we have the low carbon fuel standard. All of these programs do help promote the production of these fuels and make them cost competitive. And I think if we're looking for greater transition, those are important pieces to have.
Great. And I know, Kamiel, in previous discussions on the federal strategy, you've raised the issue of nodes. And so we've sort of been, well, certainly Peter's been explicitly talking about that in terms of activities in Alberta, and Tahra just mentioned about British Columbia. What do you see as sort of the role of nodes in the broader strategy around hydrogen deployment?
Yeah, that's a very important question, Monica, because we are in a federation here, and to connect the pieces, the idea of nodes is a laudable idea. But what does it look like? How do we go about it? What is the role of each node? How do you seamlessly connect them? How do you select them? All of this information is kind of missing. And it just occurred to me, once I was in a first minister meeting talking about innovation in Alberta, and I came with my lofty ideas about innovation from my perspective, from my background, from Ontario perspective. And all of a sudden I'm listening to people who are talking about the seal production in their backyard. And it just came like a light bulb. Yeah, you have to see what you have in your toolbox to allow you to be effective participants. So I think nodes are very important. Let me add also that to make it happen, let's focus on the large emitters. Let's give them solutions. For example, the cement production accounts for about 5 to 7% of the CO2 emissions. The same for steel. Between cement and steel in the province, we have about 13% of the GHG emissions. Well, why don't you come to those as a starting point and offer them the incentive to employ hydrogen, as it happens in Germany and other places, and allow for a carbon diminished, I wouldn't say zero carbon yet, but carbon diminished production of steel and cement and chemical plants, which are the big emitters. So you have to start somewhere and demonstrate the benefits for people to come in.
Mm-hmm. Great. Great. So I want to turn to questions coming in from the audience, just so that folks are aware. There's over 50 questions. So please understand if we don't get to all of your questions. I know our panelists have been responding by text to some of them. So we will do our best on that front, but recognize that we're not going to be able to get to all of them for sure. So I want to come to the issue around federalism, because this is something that a number of questions, and I'm sort of going to roll them up here, a number of questions have been asking about is how do you advance on hydrogen deployment in the context of a federation like Canada's? What is the role of regional approaches? Thoughts on that front, and maybe thinking about how do we try to get our governments coordinating their various strategies, or maybe they are. I'd be happy to learn more about that from the panelists. What are your thoughts on this, folks?
Well, it's hard enough to wrap your mind around the commercial issues, let alone political. I think it's somewhat obvious to say more collaboration is obviously what's needed. And if we don't have collaboration and a unified vision to have a national strategy, much like is outlined in this report, we're going to have unnecessary barriers. So, I'm not the political expert on this panel, but certainly attuned to the, I'll call it friction that can be caused by political issues. Mm-hmm. And we have to do whatever we can to try and overcome those issues. Because I think it was already mentioned, each region has its own energy sources. Each province has its own resources underneath its feet, so to speak. Quebec, Manitoba, BC have hydro. Alberta has natural gas, lots of wind and sun. Other provinces have their own set of circumstances. So there has to be some unified acknowledgement of how we can bring it all together in the global and in the national pursuit of transitioning to the lower carbon intensity.
Sure, for sure, Peter. Sometimes easier said than done for all the reasons we can imagine. Kamiel, Tahra, thoughts on that question?
I'm sorry, I missed the question because my internet kind of died on me. What was it again?
Oh, so looking at how to realize opportunities for hydrogen in the Canadian context when we are a federation with different regional energy systems, different sometimes political interests across the country.
Okay, I'll jump very quickly here. I think as a first step, and I just submitted that to the province. If the government of Canada or Ontario, for that matter, can fund a study that compare different methods of hydrogen production, let's get to the core of it. Let's establish some standards and threshold. So, for example, we say, okay, we need hydrogen that produces no more than X of emission. We need hydrogen that is produced at certain value. And then let's get away from the colors and focus on which method, and there is a plethora of methods of producing hydrogen, which method actually will allow us to reach our goals. So become more quantitative rather than qualitative in our approach. And I think that's where perhaps the strategy is missing on. Becoming very specific, very quantitative as to what are the standards and the goals in numerical values.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's something Tahra had mentioned as well. Tahra, any thoughts on this question around federalism?
Well, I think it's important to set the framework, and I think each region will have their own particular ways and methods and rules and regulations, but it should all be aligned under an umbrella of a federal strategy and federal rules. I mean, I can speak a little bit to on the practical side how this can be an issue. If you have provincial barriers that are or differences or substantial differences in provincial regulations, for example, a technology that maybe is being used in one region cannot be easily used in the other because of either a difference in perception or a difference in just the finite rules. And I think hydrogen is kind of the use of hydrogen is going to be one of those things that's going to bring out a lot of the barriers that are there. So if we can't reduce those barriers or eliminate those barriers, at least there should be a federal guideline to how things should be produced in absence of a regulation that's or a pan-Canadian regulatory structure, just so that provinces, as they're going through some of the hiccups of getting either production online or technologies in use, that they can say, okay, well, these are federal guidelines and everyone's going to agree to adhere to them. You could have a situation where you could be having to share pipelines, you could be having to share grid, you could having to share roads, safety regulations. So all of those things have to be worked out a little bit in advance. Otherwise, you're going to have, an inability for technologies and to prosper across the country. So I guess in a nutshell, that's what I would say that we need to.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the thought too that, at some level, how is this different from any other energy and climate issue that we face in Canada? What are some of the common challenges and obstacles, but also opportunities that federalism implies? So we've got a lot of questions coming in around the United States, notably in the context of a new administration that's going to be coming in this week. What are your perspectives on potential collaborations between Canada and the United States around hydrogen? Are you feeling optimistic on that front? Are there existing collaborations that you're aware of that should be scaled up? Where are the key opportunities? Thoughts on that front? A lot of folks are interested in that broader North American context.
Well, again, I'm not going to claim to be an expert on American politics. It seems to be more like a reality TV show down there. But I think we can expect definitely more stimulus funding, more policies that are green, clean fuel oriented. And I think this leads to maybe a perspective that's important. There's no question in my mind how it plays out in the United States. It's going to be very aggressive and competitive. And I think that the hydrogen, I'll call it supply chain, it needs to recognize that there are many ways to turn a wheel. There are many ways to do all sorts of end use applications now, many pathways, and that it's going to be very, very competitive. And it is going to be a very interesting decade to see, whether, small modular reactors on the nuclear side, all sorts of other types of technologies that in some segments of the hydrogen pathways compete, right? Or even in the end use. I mean, it's very competitive in the light duty vehicle market. I would argue that that's already been conquered by electric vehicles. And that, I'm not personally all that optimistic on light duty fuel cell vehicles. I think the batteries are getting better and better. The range is getting longer and longer, and that's probably done. But there's many other segments of the economy that the jury is still out. Mm-hmm. And so where hydrogen will play relative to these other fiercely competitive technologies, that will be the beneficiaries of US stimulus dollars somehow, either directly or indirectly, and their capital markets. That is going to be very interesting to watch. And we as Canadians need to watch that, because ultimately we have to compete.
For sure. I mean, so there's not only what an incoming administration, might do, but there's also, one of the things that we've seen over the last number of years is that, there has the sort of robustness of Canada-US energy and broader environmental relations mm-hmm. is kind of weakened, shall we say, over time. And, Keystone aside, there's potentially a very, open collaboration opportunity with the incoming Biden administration. Mm-hmm. Tahra, Kamiel, what if you had the ear of the Biden administration on hydrogen, where would you see as some of the key opportunities?
I'm not very optimistic, to be honest, for two reasons. Number one, does the U.S. need us for producing hydrogen? They have the technology and they have the method. And number two, which is more important, I don't believe that the Biden administration will take a different approach to climate change. They will go with the traditional, methods of shut this and close this and cancel this, rather than the progressive approach that is being taken globally by turning a challenge into opportunity. And hydrogen is a challenge that we turn into an opportunity for post-pandemic, recovery. So my suspicion is that they will follow the traditional way of the old-fashioned, methodology of reducing carbon emission, rather than utilizing this innovation, this new market to spur a great deal of good economy moving forward. So I'm afraid I'm not very optimistic.
Thanks, Kamiel. Tahra, would you agree with that, or do you have a more positive assessment?
I'm a little bit more positive on it. I think that we already have, in BC anyway, a close relationship with Washington State and California. There's a lot of information transfer, and we do have fueling infrastructure agreements, and the hydrogen highway for light duty is still, I think, something that can be energized if it's been a little bit neglected over the last 4 years. I think that Canadian technology in hydrogen has been really innovative around the world, world leaders in innovating on hydrogen technology. I think American economy has been really good at helping commercialize that technology. And I think that there's opportunities to implement, more and more. If I speak to transportation, I think that having heavy duty trucks built in the United States or in collaboration with Canada using our technology and their manufacturing, I think there's an opportunity to get some projects on the go. In BC, we still have quite a lot of north-south traffic as well as across Canada traffic. So I'm gonna go a little bit more optimistic. There's a lot of people that have been working on hydrogen a long time in the United States, and if there's an opportunity for them to have policies to help promote it, I'm gonna take a risk and be a bit more optimistic.
Okay, great. So we have time for one more sort of set of questions. I'm going to bundle a few of them up here that are all relating to the issues around having functional hydrogen markets, having a hydrogen economy. And so we've got a number of questions coming in. One, is the carbon tax sufficient when it comes to stimulating the development of markets? Another one that's asking around different types of demand for hydrogen. So what are some of the different demand types that we might see in terms of how hydrogen would be utilized and applied? And then there was a third question around, if governments are going to be putting focus on different sectors in terms of expenditures and subsidies for market development, where should they be focused first? And I'm noticing as I'm asking this question that we seem to have lost Kamiel. He had mentioned something about his internet connection being a bit shaky a moment ago. It looks like it might have really shaken up. So hopefully he'll jump back on. But in the meantime, Tahra and Peter, maybe a minute from each of you on that before we close off for today.
Sure, go ahead, Tahra.
I'm going to pass over to you.
Okay, well, at $170 a ton, things get interesting. And I think the question is, how is that $170 a ton and also the clean fuel standard and the interplay going to work? This is where I get back to the competitive nature of all the different potential supply chains. So whether it's big industry or whether it's the individual consumer, as the traditional energy systems get taxed and become more expensive, the question is, what alternative do they retreat to? Or not retreat isn't the right word, do they switch to? And the $170 a ton is over the course of the decade, right? By the time we get, so how other technologies evolve relative to hydrogen and how hydrogen evolves, and if we can take care of all these market mechanisms and commercialization issues appropriately within the hydrogen space, then it will be an alternative that the carbon tax and other policy mechanisms will switch to. But it's not, I guess my point from the beginning has been, it's not clear to me, and it's not clear to anybody, which will be the dominant pathways that will be. I would say the one thing that I'm convinced of is that for light duty vehicles, I think battery electric has already won.
Yeah.
Okay, that I'm pretty sure of. But the other ones, it's jump ball right now.
Tahra, thoughts now that you've had a chance to hear Peter's response?
Well, I think it's, I agree there that, 170 marker, it's a point in time looking at declining fossil fuel use, and it's for up for determination what fuels are going to help fill that void. Incent the production of lower carbon fuels have been successful. The credit approach has been successful, and there's different mechanisms to promote this. In BC, where we have a couple of different ways that this is happening. So I think there's as fossil fuels become more expensive, there will be other fuels that take the place, whether it's hydrogen or a combination of hydrogen and other fuels. It's still pretty early days to tell what's going to fall. into place.
Great. Thanks, Tahra. I mean, one doesn't like to end on the note of it's complicated and uncertain, but it is a little bit difficult not to come to that conclusion. But I think all the more, importance, or all the more important to hold the sorts of sessions that we've held today. We hope that those who've been participating today have found this useful. Please don't hesitate to connect with us. We'd be happy to put you in touch with speakers. Professor Gabriel's presentation will be posted on the website of the ISSP following this session. So now would be the time. Normally, if we were all together in person, I would ask everyone to, join me in thanking the panelists. Of course, we can't do that today. So I will, on behalf of many people who are here today, thank all three of you for a tremendous webinar around hydrogen. I'd also like to thank all of those at the ISSP who helped to organize this. Marissa Beck, who did a tremendous job bringing everybody together. Raphael Desordi, who got all of the communications and webinar working for us. So we wish everyone a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much to our panelists, and we shall see you soon. Bye for now.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye.